The Genius Who Stunned His Professor, a story of talent and triumph. At Columbia University, inside one of the largest lecture halls on campus, students slowly settled into their seats. Pages rustled as they flipped through well-worn notebooks, and the soft tapping of laptop keys filled the air. It was a typical Tuesday morning, but for the students enrolled in Professor Celeste Vaughn's advanced calculus course, there was nothing typical about it. This was one of the hardest classes in the entire mathematics department, notorious for its difficulty and for Professor Vaughn's brutal teaching style. She was a woman who commanded authority the moment she entered a room. Her sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, and an icy, no-nonsense gaze could make even the most confident students shrink in their seats. Vaughn did not tolerate mediocrity. If you wanted to pass her class, you had to earn it. No shortcuts. No sympathy. And today, she was in no mood for nonsense. She strode to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the tile floor, and in one swift motion, snapped a piece of chalk between her fingers. The room fell silent. "All right," she said, brushing a stray strand of blonde hair from her face. "Last lecture, we covered multivariable limits. Today, we move forward, Laplace transforms." She turned to the board and began writing long, intricate equations in her precise, perfect script. Students scrambled to take notes, some already lost in the symbols, others nodding as if they understood. Professor Vaughn thrived in this environment. The struggle, the pressure, the silent competition, it reinforced her belief that only the truly gifted belonged in her world. At least, that's what she thought. Near the middle of the lecture hall, one student sat quietly, tapping his pen against his notebook. Unlike the others, he wasn't frantically writing down notes. He wasn't struggling. If anything, he looked bored. His name was Elijah Brooks. Tall, lean, and always dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, Elijah wasn't the type to draw attention. He rarely spoke in class, never interrupted the professor, and never made a spectacle of himself. But behind that quiet demeanor, his mind worked faster than most. Numbers, patterns, equations, they made sense to him in a way they didn't for others. He saw the relationships between variables before the rest of the class even finished copying the equation. And as he glanced at the board, his eyes narrowed. Something was off. A small mistake. Just a minor one, but a mistake nonetheless. Elijah hesitated. He could let it go. No one else seemed to notice. But if she caught the mistake later, she'd have to double back and waste time correcting it. Before he could decide, someone else spoke up. Professor Vaughn." A timid voice from the front row. A girl hesitated before continuing, "I think there's an error in the second line." Professor Vaughn turned slowly, arching a brow. "An error?" she repeated, as if the very idea was offensive. She glanced at the board, then smirked. "There is no error," she said flatly. The girl's face turned red, and she quickly looked down, embarrassed. Elijah exhaled. He hated this, the way some professors dismissed students, acting as if they were beyond making mistakes. Before he could stop himself, his hand was in the air. "Actually," he said, his voice calm, "there is an error." A ripple went through the room. Heads turned. Vaughn's expression didn't change, but for a brief second, irritation flickered in her eyes. "Oh," she said, crossing her arms. "Enlighten me." Elijah stood, not to show off, but simply because he didn't like speaking while seated. "It's in the second step," he explained, pointing at the board. "You applied the transformation to the wrong term. The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you solve it using your method, the final answer won't match the expected result." Silence. Vaughn's jaw tightened. She turned back to the board, scanning her own work. And then, there it was. The mistake. For a moment, Elijah thought she might just admit it and move on. But then, her lips curled into a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Brooks," she said, turning to face him, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A few students chuckled under their breath. Elijah could hear the unspoken message behind her words. She didn't want to acknowledge that he was right. She wanted to put him on the spot. Make him hesitate. Make him stumble. But that wasn't going to happen. Elijah set down his notebook, walked calmly to the front of the room, and took the chalk from her hand. He wasn't going to hesitate. What Professor Vaughn didn't realize was that she had just set something in motion. Elijah stepped up to the board, chalk in hand. The weight of the room pressed in. The silent expectations. The professor's piercing gaze drilling into his back. The quiet murmurs from students, wondering if he was about to make a fool of himself. But he wasn't nervous. With smooth, deliberate strokes, he erased the incorrect part of the equation. He rewrote it carefully, his movements controlled, confident. His handwriting wasn't as perfectly neat as Vaughn's, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the numbers. And they lined up perfectly. As he worked, he spoke, not rushing, not hesitating. His voice was even, casual. "The mistake was in how the transform was applied," he explained. "You carried the coefficient outside too early, which changed the integral limits. But if you solve it this way, it keeps the function intact." The room was silent. The only sound was the soft scratch of chalk against the board. Then he finished. Set the chalk down. Stepped back. Professor Vaughn stood rigid, arms crossed, lips pressed together. She wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of a full lecture hall. Elijah could see it in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss him. Brush it off. Maybe even twist the situation so that she still looked right. Instead, she took a slow breath and nodded. "Fine," she said. "You corrected it. Congratulations." That was it. No acknowledgement. No actual praise. But Elijah didn't need it. As he returned to his seat, he could feel the shift in the room. Some students looked impressed. Others seemed irritated, probably the ones who thought he was showing off. But he wasn't. He just couldn't stand errors. And Professor Vaughn? She wasn't done with him yet. A professor's challenge, would you accept it? The chalk clicked against the tray as Elijah Brooks stepped back from the board. The once intimidating equation, now neatly solved, stood as undeniable proof of his skill. The lecture hall was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of fluorescent lights above and the shuffling of a few students shifting in their seats. At the front of the room, Professor Celeste Vaughn stood rigid, arms crossed, lips pressed together, Her gaze locked on the board as if searching for an excuse, a flaw, a way to prove him wrong. But there was nothing. Elijah had solved the equation flawlessly. She could ignore it, dismiss it, brush him off, but that would mean admitting she had set him up to fail. Instead, she took a slow breath, then nodded curtly. "Fine," she said. "You corrected it. Congratulations." That was it. No real acknowledgement, no praise. Just a simple, begrudging acceptance of reality. Some students exchanged glances. A few smirked. Others sat in stunned silence, realizing what had just happened. Elijah didn't need her approval. He never had. He just returned to his seat, aware of the eyes now on him, some filled with admiration, some irritation. There would always be students who thought he was just showing off. But he wasn't. He just couldn't stand mistakes, especially ones that could have been avoided. Professor Vaughn turned back to the board, grabbed a fresh piece of chalk, and wiped away his work without another word. Then, in a crisp, almost too controlled voice, she spoke. "Since Mr. Brooks is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Elijah blinked. "Excuse me." But Vaughn was already writing. This time, the equation sprawled across half the board, intricate and brutal, integrals, limits, a particularly tricky differential component woven in. She finished the last symbol with a flourish, then turned back to him. "Since you have such a keen eye," she said smoothly, "solve this." A few students shifted uncomfortably. Elijah leaned forward slightly, scanning the equation. He knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a normal question, not at this level. It was far beyond the scope of the class, something that would challenge even a graduate student. She didn't expect him to get it right. She expected him to hesitate, to stumble, to make it partway through before realizing he was in over his head. She wanted to prove that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. Elijah exhaled through his nose. "Fine." He stood again, walked calmly to the board. A few students chuckled, expecting a disaster. Vaughn smirked, stepping back, folding her arms. "Take your time," she said. Elijah didn't need time. He picked up the chalk and started writing. Not hesitating. Not second-guessing. Just solving. Every symbol, every number, flowed effortlessly from his mind to his hand. He didn't even pause. His brain was already 5 steps ahead, visualizing the solution before his fingers had finished the previous line. The room grew quieter. The murmurs stopped. Vaughn's smirk faded. Halfway through the equation, Elijah glanced at her. "I assume you want the solution in terms of exponentials instead of trigonometric functions?" She didn't answer. He kept going. A few more steps. A few simplifications. And then, done. He underlined the final answer, turned around, and casually set the chalk back on the tray. A deep, consuming silence filled the room. Then, from the back, a single student let out a low whistle. Vaughn's expression was unreadable. She scanned his work, line by line, searching for an error, anything she could use to dismiss it. There was nothing. Elijah hadn't just solved it. He had solved it elegantly, clean, efficient, without unnecessary steps. A few students started whispering. A few others leaned forward, clearly realizing what had just happened. Elijah crossed his arms. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just waiting. Vaughn finally spoke, her voice tighter than before. Lucky guess. A few students laughed under their breath, but not at Elijah. He tilted his head slightly. It wasn't a guess. Vaughn exhaled sharply through her nose. Sit down, Mr. Brooks. Elijah turned and walked back to his seat. And he felt it. The shift in the room, the way people were looking at him now. Some with admiration. Some with resentment. And one person, Professor Vaughn, with something else entirely. But she wasn't done with him yet. The energy in the room had changed. No one was looking at Professor Vaughn the same way they had at the start of class. Elijah hadn't set out to embarrass her. That wasn't his goal. But he also wasn't about to shrink himself just to make her comfortable. Vaughn turned back to the board, gripping the chalk tighter than before. She continued with the lecture, but her words lacked their usual sharpness. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence. She turned back to the class, scanning the rows of students. And then, her gaze landed back on him. The ultimate challenge, would you accept? The tension in the lecture hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Professor Celeste Vaughn stood at the front, arms crossed, a forced smile playing on her lips. But behind that smile was something else entirely, a challenge, a provocation, and perhaps even a bit of desperation. If you're so confident, Mr. Brooks, she said smoothly, how about we raise the stakes? A few students chuckled under their breath. Others leaned forward, sensing that something big was about to happen. Elijah Brooks didn't react at first. He simply studied her, analyzing the situation just as he would an equation. What do you mean? He asked. Vaughn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she strode over to her desk, her heels clicking against the tile floor, and pulled out a thick, heavy textbook. She flipped through the pages with purpose, finally stopping at a section deep within the book, far beyond anything the class had covered. Then she turned the book around for the class to see. Dense equations filled the page. Complex integrals, differential operators, and abstract transformations. This was material reserved for advanced graduate students, nowhere near what an undergraduate class would be expected to handle. Vaughn tapped her manicured finger against a particularly intimidating problem. This, she said, her voice carrying through the silent room, is from an advanced graduate level course. Something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to be able to solve. A murmur rippled through the class. The challenge was clear. Vaughn wanted to break him. This wasn't about skill anymore. It was about power. She wanted to push him past his limit, to force him into a struggle in front of the entire class. Maybe he'd get part of the way through, hesitate, and that's when she would step in, re-establishing her authority, reminding everyone why she was the one in charge. She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. But since you seem to have such a natural talent for this, she continued, why don't you prove it? Elijah exhaled slowly. He could see exactly what she was doing. This was a setup, not an opportunity. He could refuse, he didn't owe her anything. But then he glanced at the class. Some students were waiting for him to back down. Others looked genuinely intrigued, curious to see if he could actually pull it off. The weight of expectation settled on his shoulders. His decision was made for him. He stood up. For just a second, Vaughn's smirk wavered. Elijah walked toward the front of the room. She handed him the textbook, but he didn't even look at it. He had already memorized the problem. He picked up the chalk. He knew this game. Vaughn had pulled this trick before, choosing problems just out of reach to humble students who thought too highly of themselves. But this time, she had miscalculated. Elijah lived for problems like this. The room was silent as he started writing. His movements were controlled, deliberate. The problem was brutal, no question about it. But tough didn't mean impossible. As he worked, the whispers in the room faded. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic scratch of chalk against the board. Elijah didn't rush. He let each step unfold naturally, flowing seamlessly from one transformation to the next. Every simplification, every manipulation of the equation, led inevitably to the answer. And then, finally, he boxed the final result. He turned back to the class. Silence. Professor Vaughn's face was expressionless, but too still. Her jaw tightened. Her posture was too rigid, as if she were forcing herself to remain composed. She had thought this would put him in his place. Instead, he had just made her look like a fool. A low laugh came from the back of the room. Yo, what? Even the students who had been skeptical before were now staring at Elijah differently. Vaughn's hand twitched slightly at her side. She had to say something. She had to take back control of the room. You've skipped a step, she said, her voice clipped. Elijah raised an eyebrow. No, he said simply. Her fingers curled slightly. Yes, you did. Elijah turned back to the board, scanning his own work. Then, without missing a beat, he pointed to a section near the middle. This step here, where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition, he said. That's what you're talking about. Vaughn didn't answer. He nodded, calmly. I didn't skip it, he continued. I just did the calculation mentally because it was straightforward. The class was dead silent. Vaughn's face was tightening by the second. Elijah turned back to her. But if you'd like, he added, I can write it out the long way. It wasn't cocky. It wasn't even challenging. It was just matter of fact. And that made it worse. He wasn't trying to make her look bad. She was doing that to herself. Vaughn inhaled sharply. No, that won't be necessary. She turned back to her desk, setting the textbook down a little harder than she needed to. Elijah sat down, but he knew this wasn't over. The way Vaughn stood there, her posture too stiff, her jaw too tight. She was already figuring out her next move. The students, meanwhile, were still digesting what had just happened. Some were exchanging glances. Others were whispering in low voices. Then, from the second row, a hand shot up. Professor. It was Zane Mitchell, one of Vaughn's favorite students. If he got it right, Zane leaned forward, Doesn't that mean he just solved a graduate-level problem? Shouldn't that mean something? Vaughn's lips pressed into a thin line. Zane wasn't wrong. But admitting it would mean acknowledging that she had underestimated Elijah. She refused to give him that victory. I never said it was impossible, she responded smoothly. Only that it would be difficult for an undergraduate. Her word choice was deliberate, a subtle reframing of the situation, as if she had expected him to succeed all along. Elijah let out a slow breath. He wasn't looking for validation. He didn't need her approval. But the class did. They needed to see what was really happening here. And so, he waited. Because this wasn't over yet. The ultimate test, can Elijah handle the pressure? A hushed silence filled the lecture hall. Professor Celeste Vaughn had yet to respond. Her eyes flickered toward Elijah Brooks, and for the first time, something about her gaze seemed different. It wasn't just annoyance or frustration anymore. It was calculation. Then, finally, she smiled. I think, she said, her voice softer now, Mr. Brooks would benefit from an academic challenge. A few students perked up. Was she actually recognizing his talent? Was she about to suggest a higher-level placement? Elijah wasn't convinced. And he was right to be suspicious. Vaughn continued, her voice carrying through the room. I'd like to invite him to a little competition. A murmur spread through the class. Elijah frowned. What kind of competition? Vaughn walked to her desk, pulling out a folder. She flipped it open, scanning the pages inside. There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium coming up next month, she explained. Some of the best students from different schools in the region will be competing. It's a rigorous, high-pressure environment. Not just about solving problems, she glanced at him, but about doing it under time constraints. With an audience. Then she looked up, her gaze locking onto his. I assume, she said, you'd be up for it. Elijah immediately understood what this was. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a trap. Vaughn wasn't just testing his math skills. She was testing whether he could handle the pressure, whether he could perform outside the safety of a classroom. If he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates. It would be in front of professors, graduate students, and some of the best minds in the field. The weight of the moment settled on him. Students were waiting for his answer. If he backed down now, it would confirm what Vaughn wanted people to believe, that today had been a fluke. That he wasn't actually as capable as he seemed. And if he accepted, he had to win. Elijah exhaled slowly. Then nodded. I'm in. Vaughn's smile didn't reach her eyes. Excellent. But Elijah knew, she wasn't finished with him yet. The news spread fast. By the time Elijah stepped out of the lecture hall, students were already whispering about it in the hallways. Some nodded at him with newfound respect. Others looked at him like an athlete about to enter a championship game, curious, expectant, waiting to see if he'd live up to the hype. But Elijah barely paid attention. He had bigger things to focus on. The symposium was in 4 weeks. That meant he had 4 weeks to prepare for a competition that people spent months, sometimes years, training for. That night, he sat in the campus library, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks filled with calculations, and a half-empty coffee cup that had long gone cold. He had always loved math. But this was different. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was personal. Elijah, burning the midnight oil already? He looked up to see Zane Mitchell standing by his table, hands in his pockets. Zane smirked, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "Dude," he said, shaking his head. "You're already ahead of half the people who compete in these things." Elijah just nodded, flipping through a page of equations. "Vaughn's just pissed that you embarrassed her. That's the only reason she threw you into this." Elijah leaned back in his chair. "I know." Zane studied him for a second. "So why do it?" Elijah thought about that. He had asked himself the same thing more than once. He didn't need to prove anything. He could have walked away. Let the moment pass. But he knew how people like Vaughn operated. If he backed down, she'd use it as confirmation, she'd find a way to frame it. Say that he was talented but not disciplined enough, intelligent but not ready for real challenges. She would make sure that's what people remembered. Elijah wasn't going to let that happen. "Because she expects me to lose," he finally said. "And I want her to be wrong." Zane grinned. "Now that, I can respect." 4 weeks later, Elijah stood inside a large, auditorium-style lecture hall at Harvard University. The stage was set. The panel of judges sat at the front. A long digital timer loomed overhead. Competitors sat in assigned seats, their desks filled with scratch paper, pens, and one simple directive: solve the problems faster and more accurately than everyone else. Vaughn was in the audience. She hadn't spoken to him much leading up to this. No encouragement. No advice. Just a polite nod when they arrived. As if she were a mere observer, instead of the person who had thrown him into this. Elijah knew what she was waiting for. She wanted to see if he'd crack. The timer started. Elijah didn't hesitate. The first round was mental math, solving problems without writing anything down. While some competitors paused, hesitated, Elijah's hands moved without stopping, punching numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could verify them. The second round was theoretical application, breaking down complex concepts into mathematical proofs. Here, his natural intuition took over. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were patterns. Rhythms. Structures that built upon one another. The third round, speed solving. This was where most people tripped up. The pressure could make even the best students second-guess themselves. But Elijah thrived under pressure. He had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. And he wasn't going to let Vaughn, or anyone else, take it from him. The final round had arrived. The air inside the Harvard University lecture hall was thick with anticipation. Competitors, judges, and spectators, all watching, waiting for the last challenge to determine the winner. Elijah Brooks sat at his desk, his fingers lightly gripping his pen, his mind sharp. This was it. The last problem flashed on the screen. It was brutal, a multi-layered equation designed to break even the best minds in the competition. Across the room, His last remaining rival, a PhD candidate from Stanford, Felix Harrington, furrowed his brows as he analyzed the problem. Elijah? He exhaled. He could see the answer before his pen even touched the paper. His hand moved effortlessly, not hesitating, not second-guessing. Numbers flowed like water, each line perfectly leading to the next. Minutes ticked by. Then. Done. Elijah boxed his final answer just as the timer buzzed. He looked up. Across the room, Felix was still writing, his face tense. A judge stood up and walked over to check both answers. The room was silent, everyone holding their breath. Then the announcement came. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Elijah Brooks. The room erupted. Some students clapped, some let out audible gasps, but Elijah? He just exhaled, letting the moment sink in. He had won. Not just against his competitors. Not just against Vaughn's expectations. But against every unspoken doubt, every assumption, every attempt to prove that he didn't belong. As the crowd buzzed with excitement, Professor Vaughn remained still in her seat. For the first time, her face was unreadable. Then, a slow nod. No words. No forced smile. Just recognition. That was all Elijah needed. Because he hadn't come here to prove himself to her. He had come here to prove something to himself. And he had. Elijah's victory was just the start. What would come next? More competitions. More challenges. One thing was certain, he wasn't stopping here. Because the best way to change people's minds isn't with words. It's with undeniable results. The lesson behind Elijah's story, why it matters. Elijah Brooks' journey wasn't just about math. It was about resilience, confidence, and the courage to stand your ground, even when the odds are stacked against you. His story reminds us that talent alone isn't enough. It's about how you handle pressure, doubt, and even the people who want to see you fail. Professor Vaughn never expected Elijah to succeed. In fact, she set him up to fail publicly, hoping to prove that he wasn't as capable as he appeared. But instead of backing down, Elijah met every challenge head-on. He didn't ask for approval. He didn't wait for validation. He let his work speak for itself. And isn't that a lesson for all of us? How many times have you been doubted, overlooked, or underestimated? How many times have people assumed you weren't good enough, not because of your abilities, but because of their own preconceived notions? This story teaches us that the best way to silence critics isn't through words, it's through results. When people expect you to fail, you prove them wrong by showing up, doing the work, and succeeding anyway. Elijah's success didn't come from luck. It came from preparation, determination, and the mindset that no challenge was too big for him. He didn't just win a competition, he rewrote the way people saw him. He earned their respect, not by demanding it, but by proving he deserved it. And that's a lesson we can all take with us. So, the next time someone doubts you, whether it's at work, in school, or in life, remember Elijah. Stand your ground. Stay calm. And let your results do the talking. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. We share real-life lessons that push you to be better, to rise above challenges, and to never let doubt hold you back. And let us know in the comments, have you ever faced a moment like Elijah's? A time when you had to prove yourself against all odds? Share your story below, and let's inspire each other to keep pushing forward.